Hey guys, tonight we're going back to ancient Greece, to a time when the most dedicated athletes in the world would spend literally hours each day covering themselves in oil, scraping it off, and doing it all over again. This wasn't vanity. This wasn't a spa treatment. This was training. And if you think modern athletes have rigorous preparation routines, wait until you hear about what a Greek pentathlete had to do before he could even think about competing. The gymnasium in ancient Greece opened before dawn. You would arrive in darkness, the stone floors still cool from the night, and you would immediately strip naked. Complete nudity was mandatory for all athletic training and competition. The word gymnasium itself comes from the Greek word gymnos, meaning naked. There was no debate about this, no modest corner where you could keep your tunic on. Clothing during exercise was considered barbaric, something only non-Greeks would do. So there you stood, naked in the pre-dawn chill, surrounded by dozens of other naked men, all of you about to begin the same tedious, time-consuming ritual that every Greek athlete performed every single day. The first step was the oil. Not just any oil, but specifically olive oil, stored in large ceramic vessels called araboloi that you would carry with you everywhere. These weren't small bottles. A serious athlete might use a liter or more of olive oil in a single training session. The oil had to be fresh, ideally pressed within the last few months, because rancid oil was believed to be bad for the skin and muscles. Some athletes were particular about which region their oil came from. Oil from Athens was considered excellent. Oil from certain parts of the Peloponnese was preferred by others. There were connoisseurs of athletic olive oil the way there are connoisseurs of wine today. You would begin by pouring the oil into your hands. The amount mattered. Too little, and you weren't properly covered. Too much, and you'd waste valuable oil that cost money. Most athletes developed an instinct for the right amount through years of daily practice. You would start with your arms, rubbing the oil into your skin with firm, methodical strokes. The motion was always the same, long, sweeping movements that followed the direction of the muscle fibers. This wasn't random massage. Greek physicians had specific theories about how oil should be applied to enhance athletic performance. The process of oiling your entire body could take 20 to 30 minutes if you were thorough, and you needed to be thorough. You would oil your legs, spending extra time on the thighs and calves where the major muscles were. You would oil your torso, front and back, making sure to get the areas between your ribs and around your waist. You would oil your neck and face. You would even oil your genitals, because remember, you were completely naked, and Greek athletes believed that every part of the body needed to be properly prepared. If you were a wrestler, you would use even more oil, creating such a thick coating that your opponent would struggle to grip you. But here's what made this truly tedious. You couldn't oil your own back properly. You needed a partner. Every athlete in the gymnasium would pair up with another athlete, and you would take turns oiling each other's backs. This was a social ritual as much as a practical one. You would chat while you oiled your partner's back. You would discuss strategy, gossip about other athletes, complain about your trainer. The gymnasium was as much a social club as it was a training facility, and these long, boring preparation rituals were when most of the socializing happened. Once you were fully oiled, you would proceed to the next step: dust. Yes, dust. Greek athletes would deliberately cover their oiled bodies with dust or sand. There was a special area in every gymnasium called the conisterion, which was essentially a room full of dust. You would enter this room and either roll around in the dust on the floor or have handfuls of dust thrown over you. The dust would stick to the oil, creating a kind of second skin that Greek athletes believed had multiple benefits. First, the dust and oil mixture supposedly regulated body temperature. Ancient Greek physicians theorized that the coating helped prevent excessive sweating during exercise while also protecting the skin from the sun during outdoor training. Whether this was actually true is questionable, but Greek athletes absolutely believed it. Second, the mixture was thought to strengthen the skin itself. Greek medical theory held that the combination of oil and dust worked into the skin through exercise and friction would literally make your skin tougher and more resilient. Third, for wrestlers and other combat athletes, the gritty texture of the dust oil coating made it slightly easier to grip while still being slippery enough to require skill. The amount of dust you applied was once again a matter of careful consideration. Too little, and you'd just be slippery. Too much, and you'd look like you'd been buried alive. Experienced athletes knew exactly how much dust to apply for their particular sport. A long-distance runner might use less dust than a wrestler. A boxer might apply dust in certain patterns that emphasized his musculature. There was even social signaling involved in how you applied your dust. A perfectly even coating suggested discipline and attention to detail. A haphazard dusting suggested you were either lazy or too focused on actual training to care about appearances. Now you were ready to train. Finally. Except your training itself would involve periodically reapplying oil and dust as the mixture wore off through sweat and friction. A serious training session might last 4 to 6 hours, and you might need to reapply your coating 2 or 3 times during that period. Each reapplication meant stopping your training, finding your oil flask, carefully applying more oil, visiting the dust room, and starting again. And we haven't even discussed the strigil yet. The strigil was a curved metal scraper, usually made of bronze or iron, that was used to remove the oil-dust-sweat mixture from your skin after training. The word strigil comes from the Latin strigilis, but the Greeks called it astlengis. Every athlete owned at least one strigil, and wealthy athletes might own several of different sizes and curvatures for different parts of the body. After training, you would use your strigil to scrape all the accumulated grime off your skin. This wasn't a quick rinse. You would stand in a specific area of the gymnasium designed for this purpose, and you would methodically scrape every inch of your body. The technique mattered. You held the strigil at a specific angle and applied firm pressure, pulling it along your skin to remove the built-up layer of oil, dust, and sweat. The scrapings would fall to the floor, where they would be collected by gymnasium slaves. And here's a detail that seems almost too strange to be true, but it absolutely was. The scrapings from famous athletes were collected and sold. That's right. The dirty, sweaty, oily residue scraped off the bodies of successful Olympic athletes was bottled and sold as a medical treatment. It was called gloios. Rich people would buy gloios from champion athletes and use it as an ointment for sore muscles or joint pain. Whether it had any actual medical benefit is extremely doubtful, but it was popular enough that there was a legitimate market for it. Some famous athletes became almost as wealthy from selling their gloios as they did from their athletic victories. The strigiling process itself could take another 20 to 30 minutes. You had to scrape your arms, your legs, your torso. You had to be careful around sensitive areas. You had to get your back done, which again required a partner. Some gymnasiums had slaves whose entire job was to strigil athletes who didn't have training partners present. After you were fully scraped, you would typically apply another light coating of clean oil to moisturize your skin. Then, and only then, were you truly finished with the day's athletic preparation ritual? Let's think about the time investment here. 30 minutes for initial oiling, 5 to 10 minutes for dusting, 4 to 6 hours of actual training with 2 or 3 reapplication breaks of 15 minutes each, 30 minutes for striduling, another 10 minutes for post-training oiling. On a typical training day, a serious Greek athlete might spend an hour to 90 minutes just on the oil dust scraping routine, separate from the actual athletic training. And this was every single day. If you were a professional athlete, training for the Olympics or the other Pan-Hellenic Games, you did this daily for years. The repetition was mind-numbing. The same motions, the same rituals, the same tedious attention to detail, day after day after day. Modern athletes might find this routine absurd, but to ancient Greeks, it was absolutely essential. You simply could not be a proper athlete without going through these exact preparations. The boring consistency of the routine was, in some ways, the point. Greek athletic training wasn't just about building physical strength and skill. It was about discipline, about the ability to perform the same actions with the same care every single time. The athlete who skipped steps in his oiling routine was the athlete who would cut corners in his training. The athlete who rushed through his striduling was the athlete who lacked the focus to win. There were written guidelines for all of this. Athletic trainers called pedotribes would supervise training and enforce proper oil application techniques. Some trainers became famous for their particular methods of oil application or their theories about the optimal ratio of oil to dust. Medical writers like Galen wrote extensively about athletic preparation, including multiple chapters on the proper use of oil and the stridule. This wasn't folk tradition or superstition. This was considered sophisticated scientific athletic training. But why olive oil specifically? Greece had olive oil in abundance, certainly, but there was more to it than simple availability. Greek medical theory held that olive oil had specific properties that made it ideal for athletic training. It was believed to be warming to the body without being excessively hot. It was thought to have a balanced nature that could help regulate the humors. It was considered moistening to the skin and muscles, preventing them from becoming too dry and brittle. Other oils were available: sesame oil, almond oil, but olive oil was considered superior for athletic purposes. The economics of this were significant. A serious athlete in training for the Olympics might use 10 to 15 liters of olive oil per month just for his training routine. At typical ancient Greek prices, this represented a substantial expense. Most athletes came from wealthy families, because poor families simply couldn't afford the cost of olive oil required for serious athletic training. There were occasional public subsidies for promising poor athletes, but these were rare. For the most part, athletic training in ancient Greece was a pursuit of the wealthy, and the olive oil requirement was one of the main reasons why. Consider the daily experience of this from a young athlete's perspective. You're 16 years old. You've shown promise in wrestling. Your father has decided you'll train seriously, possibly compete at the local games, maybe even aim for Olympia someday. So every morning, before the sun rises, you walk to the gymnasium. You strip naked. You stand there in the cool morning air while an older athlete, your assigned training partner, pours olive oil onto your back and rubs it in with firm, practiced strokes. You chat with him about nothing important. You discuss the weather or another athlete's injury or rumors about who the judges will be at the upcoming games. His hands work the oil into your shoulder blades, down your spine, across your lower back. This takes 5 minutes, maybe 10. Then you oil his back. Then you both visit the dust room. Then you train. Then, hours later, you scrape it all off. Then you start over the next day, and the next day, and the next day, for years, the mind-numbing repetition of it, the sheer boring predictability, the same conversations, the same motions, the same smell of olive oil and dust and sweat. This was the reality of ancient Greek athletic training. Not the glory of competition, not the excitement of victory, but the daily grind of preparation. The hours spent on maintenance and ritual, the tedious attention to detail that never ended. And yet, Greek athletes were among the best in the ancient world. Their training methods produced champions. Their attention to these seemingly boring details created a culture of athletic excellence that influenced Western civilization for millennia afterward. The monotony wasn't incidental to their success. It was fundamental to it. But how did this system develop in the first place? Where did the specific rituals come from? Who decided that olive oil and dust were the essential combination? And what happened to athletes who tried to skip these time-consuming preparations? The origins of the olive oil tradition in Greek athletics stretch back into the murky prehistory of Greek civilization, to a time before written records, before the Olympic Games themselves were formally established. Archaeological evidence suggests that Greek athletes were using oil in their training by at least the 8th century BCE, and probably much earlier. But the practice likely predates even our earliest evidence by centuries. The question of who first decided to cover themselves in olive oil before wrestling or running is lost to history, buried somewhere in the oral traditions that preceded Greek literacy. What we do know is that by the time Greek civilization had developed writing and began recording its own history, the oil tradition was already ancient and unquestioned. Homer, writing in the 8th century BCE, mentions oiled athletes in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus arrives at the palace of the Phaeacians, he is given olive oil to rub on his body before competing in their athletic games. The text presents this as completely normal and expected. Nobody in the story questions it or explains it. It's simply what you did before athletic competition, as natural and necessary as removing your clothes. The medical theories that justified the practice came later, developed by Greek physicians who were trying to explain and systematize traditional practices. Hippocrates, writing in the 5th century BCE, discussed the use of oil in athletics in several of his medical treatises. He believed that olive oil helped to open the pores of the skin, allowing harmful humors to escape through sweating during exercise. He also theorized that oil protected the internal organs by creating a barrier on the skin that regulated heat exchange between the body and the environment. Galen, the most influential medical writer of the ancient world, who lived in the 2nd century CE, wrote even more extensively about athletic oil use. He had direct experience with athletes, having served as a physician to gladiators in his youth. Galen's theories were more sophisticated than Hippocrates. He believed that olive oil had specific thermal properties that made it ideal for athletic training. According to Galen, olive oil was warm and moist in its essential nature, which made it perfect for balancing the hot and dry conditions created by vigorous exercise. The oil would prevent the body from becoming too hot and dry, which Galen believed could lead to injury or illness. But Galen also recognized that too much oil could be problematic. He wrote warnings about athletes who used excessive amounts of oil, arguing that this could make the body too soft and vulnerable. The key, according to Galen, was finding the right balance. Enough oil to protect and prepare the body, but not so much that it weakened the constitution. This required judgment and experience, which is why proper athletic trainers were considered valuable. The dust that athletes applied over their oil also had medical justifications. Greek physicians believed that dust helped to absorb excess moisture from the oil while retaining the beneficial properties. The dust-oil mixture created what they considered an ideal coating, slippery enough for wrestling, but textured enough to provide some grip, warm enough to protect the muscles, but not so hot that it would cause overheating. The dust also supposedly helped to close the pores slightly after the oil had opened them, maintaining a balance between open and closed that was considered medically optimal. Different types of dust were preferred for different purposes. Fine, powdery dust was considered best for runners and jumpers because it was light and didn't add significant weight. Coarser sand was preferred by wrestlers because the grittier texture provided better grip. Some gymnasiums had multiple dust rooms with different grades of dust. The most prestigious gymnasiums in Athens had specialized dust sourced from specific quarries or beaches, believed to have superior properties. There were athletes who tried to innovate or skip steps in this process, and their stories are instructive. One case mentioned in ancient sources involves an athlete named Cleomedes of Astypalia, who competed in boxing in the 5th century BCE. Cleomedes was known for being impatient with the traditional preparations. He would rush through his oiling, using barely enough oil to give his skin a light sheen. He would skip the dust room entirely on some days. His trainer warned him repeatedly that this was dangerous, that he was inviting injury, that he wasn't properly preparing his body for competition. Cleomedes ignored these warnings. He was naturally talented, and in local competitions, his shortcuts didn't seem to matter. He won fights easily. But when he competed at the Olympic Games, something went wrong. During his boxing match, Cleomedes killed his opponent with a blow to the head. This was rare, but not unheard of in ancient boxing, which was extremely brutal. But the judges ruled that Cleomedes had struck an illegal blow and disqualified him. Cleomedes went mad with rage at the disqualification. He pulled down a pillar supporting the roof of the building where the judges were meeting, killing 60 people when the roof collapsed. Ancient writers attributed Cleomedes' madness to his improper athletic preparation. They argued that by skipping the proper oiling and dusting rituals, he had allowed his humors to become unbalanced. The heat of competition, combined with his improperly prepared body, had literally driven him insane. Whether this medical explanation has any validity is extremely doubtful, but the story was told and retold as a cautionary tale about the dangers of neglecting proper athletic preparation rituals. Another story, perhaps more reliable, concerns an athlete from the 4th century BCE who decided to use a different type of oil. He had traveled to Persia and encountered athletes there who used a different preparation involving sesame oil mixed with various spices. He thought this was superior to plain olive oil and began using it in his training when he returned to Greece. His trainer was horrified. His fellow athletes mocked him. He was even temporarily banned from training at his gymnasium until he agreed to return to proper olive oil. The resistance to innovation in athletic preparation was intense. Greek athletic culture was deeply conservative, especially regarding the fundamental rituals. Any deviation from traditional practice was viewed with suspicion and hostility. This conservatism extended to every detail of the process, from the type of oil used to the angle at which you held your strigil. There were right ways and wrong ways to do everything, and the right ways were the ways that had been passed down through generations of athletes and trainers. The daily experience of this conservatism shaped the psychology of Greek athletes. You learned from childhood that success in athletics required absolute adherence to traditional practice. You learned that innovation was dangerous You learned that the boring, repetitive rituals were not optional extras, but the foundation of athletic excellence. This created a particular mindset, a willingness to subordinate individual preference to collective tradition that characterized Greek athletic culture. Let's consider the economics more carefully, because the cost of olive oil shaped who could and couldn't participate in serious athletic training. A skilled craftsman in Athens in the 5th century BCE might earn approximately 1 drachma per day. A liter of good quality olive oil would cost somewhere between 1/2 and 1 full drachma, depending on the harvest and the time of year. An athlete in serious training would use approximately 10 to 15 liters per month, representing a cost of 5 to 15 drachmas monthly just for oil. This might not sound like much, but remember that this was only the oil cost. Athletes also needed to pay for trainers, gymnasium fees, special diets, and equipment. The total cost of serious athletic training could easily represent a substantial portion of a family's income. For wealthy families, this was manageable. For middle-class families, it required real sacrifice. For poor families, it was essentially impossible without outside support. Some Greek cities recognized this problem and created systems to support promising poor athletes. Athens had a program where the city would provide oil subsidies to young athletes from poor families who showed exceptional talent. The oil would be provided from public stocks, stored in the gymnasiums, and allocated by trainers based on need and promise. But these programs were limited and competitive. Most poor boys with athletic talent never received support and never had the chance to train seriously. The oil requirement thus functioned as a kind of class barrier in Greek athletics. It ensured that most serious athletes came from wealthy families who could afford the costs. This had significant social consequences. Athletic success was highly valued in Greek culture, bringing honor to families and cities. Olympic victors received substantial rewards, including cash prizes, free meals for life, and prominent social status. But these rewards were largely accessible only to those who were already wealthy enough to afford the training costs in the first place. There were exceptions, of course. Some famous athletes came from humble backgrounds and achieved success through a combination of natural talent, public subsidy, and wealthy patronage. But they were exceptional. The typical Olympic victor came from a wealthy family that had been able to afford years of expensive training, including the enormous quantities of olive oil required for proper preparation. The gymnasium itself was a space organized around this oil-based athletic culture. Every gymnasium had specific areas dedicated to different parts of the oiling process. The apoditirion was the undressing room, where athletes would remove their clothes and store them during training. The eleothesion was the room where oil was stored and applied. The conisterion was the dust room. The palaestra was the wrestling ground. The stadium was for running. Each space had its function, and the architecture of the gymnasium reflected the importance of the oiling ritual. The design of these spaces was remarkably consistent across the Greek world. Whether you visited a gymnasium in Athens, Sparta, Olympia, or a Greek colony in Italy or Asia Minor, you would find essentially the same layout, the same sequence of rooms, the same basic architecture. This uniformity reflected the conservative, traditional nature of Greek athletic culture. The proper way to design a gymnasium was the way it had always been designed. The proper way to prepare for athletics was the way it had always been done. Slaves played an important role in maintaining these facilities. Slaves would clean the floors of the dust rooms daily, replenishing the dust from storage areas outside the building. Slaves would clean and maintain the oil storage vessels. Slaves would collect the scrapings from the striggling area and package them for sale. Slaves would heat water for the baths that athletes would use after striggling. The entire system of Greek athletics depended on slave labor to maintain the facilities and perform the tedious maintenance work that made the athletes' rituals possible. The social dynamics within the gymnasium were complex. Athletes would form friendships based on their training partnerships. The young man who oiled your back each morning became someone you knew intimately, someone you trusted. These partnerships often lasted for years, even decades in some cases. Former training partners would maintain their friendships long after their athletic careers ended. Some of these friendships had erotic dimensions. Greek culture accepted and even celebrated romantic relationships between male athletes. The intimate physical contact involved in the oiling ritual certainly contributed to the development of these relationships. But there were also hierarchies and competitions within the gymnasium. Athletes who used more expensive oil or who had more elaborate striggles were advertising their wealth and status. Athletes who had won victories at major games were accorded special respect. Younger athletes were expected to defer to older, more experienced athletes. The gymnasium was a social space as much as an athletic space, and navigating its social dynamics was as important as mastering athletic techniques. The trainers, the Pedo tribes, occupied a unique position in this social world. A good trainer was valued and respected, but trainers were generally not from the highest social classes themselves. Many trainers were former athletes who had been successful, but not wealthy enough to retire comfortably on their winnings. They would take positions as trainers in gymnasiums, teaching the next generation of athletes. The job was prestigious, but not particularly lucrative. A trainer might earn 2 or 3 drachmas per day, decent, but not wealthy. Trainers had to master not just athletic techniques, but also the entire system of preparation rituals. They needed to know proper oiling techniques for different sports. They needed to understand the medical theories that justified these practices. They needed to be able to diagnose when an athlete was using too much or too little oil. They needed to know how to modify the preparation routine for different weather conditions, different times of year, different stages of training. This knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship, with young trainers learning from experienced masters over many years. The most famous trainers developed their own methods and theories. There was a trainer in Elis named Herodicus who became famous in the 5th century BCE for his theories about athletic preparation. Herodicus believed that the oiling ritual should be combined with specific massage techniques, with the pressure and direction of the massage varying depending on the athlete's sport and body type. He developed elaborate protocols for how wrestlers should be oiled differently than runners, how sprinters should be oiled differently than long-distance runners. His methods were influential and were adopted by trainers throughout Greece. But did any of this actually improve athletic performance? That's difficult to answer with certainty. The medical theories underlying Greek athletic preparation were based on ideas about humors and bodily balance that we now know are incorrect. The idea that olive oil opens pores to release harmful humors, or that dust closes pores to maintain ideal balance, has no basis in modern physiology. So in one sense, the entire elaborate system of athletic preparation was based on mistaken medical beliefs. And yet, the system worked in its own terms. Greek athletes who followed these preparation rituals were successful competitors. They developed strong, flexible, resilient bodies. They won victories at games. Whether the olive oil and dust actually contributed to this success in the ways Greeks believed is questionable, but the rituals were part of a broader system of training discipline that clearly did produce results. The psychological benefits were probably more important than the physical ones. The daily ritual of oiling and dusting created structure and routine. It reinforced discipline and attention to detail. It created social bonds between training partners. It gave athletes a sense of control over their preparation, a feeling that they were doing everything possible to optimize their performance. These psychological factors likely mattered more than whether the oil actually regulated body temperature or strengthened skin. There's also the question of whether the oil provided any practical benefits in wrestling and combat sports. Oiled skin is indeed more slippery, which would make grappling more difficult and require greater technical skill. This might have functioned as a kind of training aid, forcing wrestlers to develop more sophisticated techniques than they would need if they were grappling with dry skin. The dust added back some friction, creating a specific texture that Greek wrestlers became expert at managing. So while the medical theories about humors were wrong, there may have been some practical training benefits that justified the practice, but the sheer time investment remained remarkable. Hours every day spent on preparation rituals based on dubious medical theories. An athlete's entire life organized around maintaining these traditional practices. The costs in time, money, and effort were substantial. And yet Greek athletes continued these practices for centuries, generation after generation, training partner after training partner, one careful application of olive oil at a time. What did this feel like psychologically to dedicate your youth to these rituals? To know that every morning for years you would strip naked, pour oil on your body, cover yourself in dust, train for hours, and scrape it all off. To have your daily rhythm entirely dictated by these ancient, unchanging practices. And what happened when this entire system began to change, when Greek athletic culture encountered other traditions and began to question its own practices? The decline of the traditional Greek athletic preparation system didn't happen suddenly. It was a gradual process that took centuries, accelerating only after Greece was conquered by Rome in the 2nd century BCE. But even before Roman conquest, there were signs that the rigid, oil-centered system was beginning to face challenges and questions from within Greek culture itself. One of the earliest criticisms came from philosophers rather than athletes. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, expressed ambivalence about the elaborate athletic preparation rituals. In his dialogue, Republic, Plato discusses education and argues that physical training is important for producing good citizens. But he also warns against excessive focus on athletics at the expense of intellectual and moral development. Plato was particularly critical of athletes who spent so much time on their preparation rituals that they had no time for philosophy or civic engagement. Plato never directly attacked the olive oil tradition, but his broader critique of excessive athleticism implied questions about whether all the time spent on oiling and dusting was really necessary. If a young man spent 2 hours every day on athletic preparation rituals, that was 2 hours he wasn't spending on studying mathematics or dialectics or learning to govern. For Plato, the ideal citizen needed physical fitness, but shouldn't be obsessed with athletic perfection. The elaborate preparation rituals represented in some ways an obsession that diverted energy from more important pursuits. Aristotle, Plato's student, was more explicit in his criticism. In his Politics, Aristotle discusses education at length and argues that athletic training should be moderate, not extreme. He specifically criticizes the Spartan system of athletic education, which was even more rigorous than the Athenian system. Aristotle believed that excessive athletic training actually damaged young people's bodies and minds rather than strengthening them. He wrote that boys who were subjected to extreme athletic regimens became animal-like, focused entirely on physical performance at the expense of reason and cultivation. Neither Plato nor Aristotle was influential enough to actually change athletic practice during their lifetimes. Athletes and trainers continued their traditional routines regardless of philosophical criticism. But the philosophical critique did establish an intellectual tradition that questioned the value of the elaborate preparation system. This tradition would become more influential later, particularly after Greek culture began to mix with other traditions. The encounter with Persian athletic practices was one important challenge to Greek traditions. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the late 4th century BCE, Greek and Persian cultures began to mix in ways they never had before. Greek soldiers and administrators living in former Persian territories encountered Persian athletes and their different training methods. Persian wrestlers, for instance, used less oil than Greeks did, preferring to wrestle with relatively dry skin. Persian runners often trained without any oil at all, considering it unnecessary for their sport. Some Greek athletes who encountered these Persian practices began to question whether all the oil was really necessary. If Persian athletes could achieve success with less elaborate preparation, perhaps Greeks were spending unnecessary time and money on their rituals. These questions were controversial, and most Greek athletes rejected them out of hand. But the mere existence of successful athletes using different methods created a crack in the seemingly monolithic Greek athletic tradition. The Roman conquest of Greece in 146 BCE accelerated these changes dramatically. Romans had their own athletic traditions, quite different from Greek ones. Roman gladiators, for instance, did use oil in their preparations, but nothing like the elaborate Greek system. Roman soldiers trained for combat without the oil dust strigil routine. Roman baths, which became increasingly popular throughout the Mediterranean world, offered a completely different approach to bodily care and cleanliness than the Greek gymnasium system. Initially, Romans who encountered Greek athletic practices were often baffled or amused by them. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described Greek athletic preparation rituals with a tone of bemused skepticism. He acknowledged that Greeks believed olive oil had special properties for athletic training, but he clearly thought the whole system was excessive and somewhat ridiculous. Pliny noted that Romans used oil in their baths for cleanliness and relaxation, not for the elaborate athletic purposes Greeks insisted upon. But despite Roman skepticism, Greek athletic practices didn't disappear immediately after conquest. In fact, Greek-style gymnasiums continued to function throughout the Roman Empire. Romans who wanted to demonstrate their sophistication and connection to Greek culture would sometimes adopt Greek athletic practices, including the oiling rituals. Greek athletic trainers found employment throughout the Roman world, teaching traditional methods to new generations. The system adapted and survived even in this changed political context. However, the system did begin to simplify. The elaborate, multi-hour preparation rituals gradually became shorter and less rigorous. Some athletes began using less oil, shortening their oiling time. The dust room became optional in some gymnasiums rather than mandatory. The strigiling process became quicker and less thorough. These changes happened gradually over generations as each new cohort of athletes modified the traditions they inherited just slightly, making them a bit more convenient, a bit less time-consuming. By the 2nd century CE, when the travel writer Pausanias was touring Greece and describing what he saw, he noted that athletic practices had changed considerably from what they had been in the classical period. Athletes still used oil, but not as much. The preparation rituals still existed, but they were abbreviated. Pausanias, who was nostalgic for the classical past, lamented these changes. He believed that modern athletes were less dedicated than their ancestors, that they had lost the discipline that made classical Greek athletics great. Galen, the physician we mentioned earlier, also wrote about these changes. Despite being a Roman-era writer, Galen was deeply committed to Greek medical traditions. He argued passionately that athletes should maintain the traditional oil-dust strigil system. He wrote case studies of athletes who had developed injuries or illnesses that he attributed to improper preparation rituals. He insisted that the classical Greek methods were medically superior to the abbreviated modern practices. But Galen was fighting a losing battle. The trend towards simplification continued. Part of this was economic. Olive oil had become more expensive in some parts of the Roman Empire due to changes in trade patterns and agricultural production. The cost of maintaining traditional Greek athletic preparation had increased, making it less accessible even to moderately wealthy families. Athletes looking to save money would naturally reduce their oil consumption, abbreviating their rituals. Part of the change was also cultural. The Roman Empire was cosmopolitan in ways that classical Greece had not been. Athletes from different regions with different traditions were competing against each other. An athlete from Egypt, trained in local methods that didn't involve elaborate oil rituals, might defeat a Greek athlete who had spent years performing traditional preparations. Such victories raised obvious questions about whether the traditional Greek methods were really superior or just different. Christianity spread through the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, added another layer of complexity. Early Christian writers had complicated relationships with Greek athletic culture. On one hand, Paul and other New Testament writers used athletic metaphors frequently, comparing Christian spiritual discipline to athletic training. On the other hand, Christian writers were often critical of the actual practices of Greek athletics, particularly the nudity and the homoerotic culture of the gymnasium. Christian writers rarely discussed the olive oil preparations specifically, but they did criticize the overall culture of Greek athletics as excessively focused on the body at the expense of the soul. As Christianity became more influential, some young men who might previously have trained as athletes instead joined monasteries or pursued religious education. The social prestige of athletic success declined somewhat, reducing the incentive to maintain the time-consuming and expensive preparation rituals. The definitive end of traditional Greek athletics came in 393 CE, when the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius I banned the Olympic Games and other pagan festivals. The Games had been held every 4 years for over 1,000 years, but Theodosius considered them incompatible with Christianity. Without the Olympics and other major competitions as goals to train for, the elaborate system of athletic preparation lost much of its purpose. Gymnasiums continued to exist in some Greek cities after this ban, but they gradually transformed into something different. Some became more like Roman baths, focusing on bathing and social interaction, rather than athletic training. Some became Christian schools or churches. Some simply fell into disuse and ruin. The specific architecture designed around the oil dust strigil ritual, the undressing rooms, oil rooms, dust rooms, scraping areas, became obsolete. By the 6th century CE, the traditional Greek athletic preparation system had essentially disappeared. There were no longer athletes spending hours each day coating themselves in olive oil and dust. The strigil became an archaeological artifact rather than a living tool. The medical theories about humors and oil and pores were forgotten or replaced by other theories. The entire elaborate system that had structured the daily lives of Greek athletes for over 1,000 years simply ended. But let's step back from this historical narrative and consider what we can learn from this strange, tedious, now vanished system. The Greek athletic oil ritual is interesting precisely because it seems so pointless from a modern perspective. We know now that the medical theories were wrong. We know that covering yourself in oil and dust doesn't actually open and close your pores in medically beneficial ways. We know that you don't need elaborate preparation rituals to be a successful athlete. And yet, for over a millennium, some of the most disciplined and successful athletes in the ancient world absolutely believed in this system and structured their entire lives around it. They weren't stupid people. They weren't blindly following tradition without thought. Greek culture produced sophisticated philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, and politicians. Greek athletes and trainers thought carefully about their practices and developed elaborate justifications for them. The oil ritual worked not because of its medical validity, but because of what it represented and reinforced: discipline, attention to detail, respect for tradition, social bonding, and psychological preparation. The athlete who spent an hour carefully oiling himself each morning was training his mind as much as his body. He was learning patience, thoroughness, and the ability to perform repetitive tasks with consistent care. These mental qualities probably contributed more to athletic success than any physical benefits the oil might have provided. This suggests something broader about how human practices develop and persist. We often do things for reasons we don't fully understand. We develop elaborate justifications for our practices based on the knowledge systems available to us. Ancient Greeks used humoral theory to explain why oil worked. We might use different explanations, but we're just as capable of developing complex rationalizations for behaviors that might not have the effects we think they do. The social dimensions of the practice were probably more important than the medical ones. The oil ritual brought athletes together daily, creating bonds and community. It established clear roles and hierarchies. It provided structure and routine to young men's lives. It connected athletes to their trainers and to the broader tradition of Greek athletics stretching back generations. These social and psychological functions mattered enormously, regardless of whether the oil actually strengthened skin or regulated temperature. There's also something to be said for the way traditional practices can create meaning and purpose even when they're tedious. Modern athletes certainly have boring aspects to their training: hours in the gym, repetitive drills, careful attention to diet and sleep. But imagine if those boring aspects were elevated into elaborate rituals with deep traditional significance. The tedium becomes meaningful when it connects you to a tradition, when it demonstrates your commitment, when it creates bonds with training partners. The Greek oil ritual also reveals something about how practices end. The system didn't vanish because someone proved it was medically invalid. It vanished because of large-scale social and political changes: conquest, cultural mixing, new religions, economic shifts. Practices that seem deeply embedded and permanent can disappear within a few generations when the social context changes. The gymnasium architecture that seemed so permanent, so necessary, became obsolete. The skills that trainers had spent lifetimes developing became worthless. The elaborate knowledge system built around athletic oil use simply evaporated. And yet something did survive: the idea that athletic training requires discipline and ritual preparation survived. The concept that athletes should prepare their bodies carefully before competition survived. Even the practice of using oil on skin for athletic or cosmetic purposes survived in modified forms. The specific Greek system disappeared, but it left traces that influenced later practices. Modern Olympic athletes don't cover themselves in olive oil and dust before competing, but they do have elaborate preparation rituals that they perform religiously. They have specific warm-up routines that must be performed exactly the same way every time. They have superstitions and habits that they believe are essential to their success. In some ways, we haven't moved as far from the ancient Greeks as we might think. We've replaced their rituals with our own, based on our own explanatory systems, but the human need for ritual preparation remains. If an ancient Greek athlete could somehow observe modern Olympic preparations, they might be baffled by some of our practices. Why do athletes wear so much clothing? Why don't they use oil? But they would probably recognize the underlying psychology, the careful attention to detail, the repetitive rituals, the belief that proper preparation is essential to success, the social bonds formed through training. These elements are consistent across cultures and time periods. The story of Greek athletes and their olive oil obsession is ultimately a story about how humans create meaning through ritual and tradition. It's a story about discipline and community. It's a story about how practices that seem essential and permanent can vanish completely when circumstances change. And it's a story about the enormous amount of time and effort humans are willing to invest in pursuits they believe are important, even when those pursuits involve spending hours each day performing tasks that later generations will find utterly bizarre. Somewhere in ancient Greece, around 400 BCE, there was a 16-year-old boy standing naked in a gymnasium, watching olive oil drip down his arms, knowing he would repeat this exact process tomorrow and the day after and every day for years to come. He couldn't have imagined that someday his entire world, the gymnasiums, the trainers, the competitions, the elaborate oil rituals, would disappear so completely that future people would need to reconstruct it from archaeological fragments and scattered literary references. He thought he was preparing himself for athletic glory using eternal, unquestionable methods. He was actually participating in a temporary, contingent cultural practice that would vanish within a few centuries. But in that moment, standing there covered in oil and dust, surrounded by other young men engaged in the same ritual, he felt connected to something larger than himself. He felt he was following in the footsteps of Olympic champions stretching back generations. He felt he was properly preparing his body through medically sound practices. He felt he belonged. And perhaps that feeling, more than anything else, was what the oil ritual was really providing. The olive wreaths given to Olympic victors are famous. Everyone knows that ancient Olympic champions received crowns woven from olive branches, symbols of glory that brought honor, but supposedly no material wealth. This is the romantic image of ancient athletics, pure competition for honor alone, unsullied by money or material concerns. But this romantic image obscures a far more complex and frankly boring reality. Behind every olive wreath was an elaborate bureaucratic system involving land surveyors, agricultural inspectors, record keepers, and accountants who spent their entire careers managing olive groves, tracking olive branch production, and administering the distribution of prizes. The sacred olive grove at Olympia, called the Altis, was not just a symbolic garden. It was a carefully managed agricultural resource that required year-round maintenance and administration. The grove covered approximately 40 acres of land adjacent to the sanctuary of Zeus. It contained hundreds of olive trees, all descended according to tradition from a single original olive tree that Heracles himself had brought from the land of the Hyperboreans and planted at Olympia. Whether this origin story had any historical truth is impossible to know, but Greeks believed it absolutely, and this belief shaped how the grove was managed. The trees in the sacred grove were not ordinary olive trees. They were never harvested for oil. Their fruit was never pressed. Their branches were used for only one purpose: weaving the victory crowns for Olympic champions. This single-purpose use meant that the trees required different management than ordinary olive groves. They needed to produce branches of specific characteristics, flexible enough to weave, beautiful enough for ceremonial purposes, but also symbolically pure, unblemished by any commercial use. Managing this grove was the responsibility of a specific religious official called the Hellenodikes, though in practice the actual work was done by a staff of subordinate officials and slaves. The head gardener of the sacred grove was typically a citizen of Elis, the city-state that controlled Olympia. This position was hereditary in certain families, passed down from father to son for generations. The head gardener's family had been tending these specific trees for so long that they knew each tree individually. Which ones produced the best branches, which ones needed extra water during dry summers, which ones were getting old and would soon need to be replaced. Replacing a tree in the sacred grove was a complex process involving religious ritual and bureaucratic procedure. First, priests would need to determine that a tree was truly beyond saving. This determination required inspection by both religious authorities and agricultural experts. If a tree was condemned, a ceremony would be held to apologize to the gods for the necessity of removing one of the sacred trees. Then and only then could the tree be cut down. But you couldn't simply plant a new tree in its place. The replacement had to be grown from a cutting of another tree in the sacred grove, maintaining the unbroken lineage back to the original tree planted by Heracles. The cutting would be taken with ceremony, blessed by priests, and planted in a nursery area where it would be tended for several years until it was strong enough to be transplanted to the main grove. During this growth period, the young tree would be monitored constantly. Records would be kept of its growth rate, the health of its leaves, any signs of disease or weakness. These records were extensive. The administrators of Olympia kept detailed agricultural journals documenting every aspect of the sacred grove's management. We know this because fragments of these records have survived on stone inscriptions and papyrus documents. One surviving inscription from the 4th century BCE lists the number of trees in the sacred grove, 412 at that time, notes which trees were cut for branch collection in that year's Olympics, 63 trees, and records the amount of water allocated to the grove during a drought, measured in specific units that corresponded to the capacity of certain ceremonial vessels. Why such detailed record-keeping for what seems like a simple task? Because the integrity of the Olympic prizes depended on absolute certainty that the olive crowns came from the proper source. An Olympic victory crown had to be woven from branches of the sacred grove at Olympia. Not from any olive tree, not from any olive grove, from these specific trees with their mythical lineage. Any deviation from this would invalidate the prize and, by extension, compromise the victory itself. This meant that every step of the process had to be documented and verified. When branches were cut from the trees, witnesses had to be present. The witnesses were typically 3 Hellene citizens of good reputation, who would later swear oaths that they had personally observed the branches being cut from the correct trees. The branches would then be bound into bundles, and each bundle would be sealed with a lead seal bearing the official mark of Olympia. These sealed bundles would be transported to a secure storage area where they would be kept until the games. The security around these olive branches was remarkable. They were stored in a specific building within the sanctuary, a structure that was locked with multiple locks. Different officials held different keys, so no single person could access the branches alone. Guards were posted. Inventories were conducted regularly. All of this for olive branches. But these were not ordinary olive branches. They were sacred objects whose authenticity had to be beyond question. The person responsible for actually weaving the crowns was another hereditary official, the Stephanoploukhos, or crown weaver. This position had been held by the same family in Elis for at least 2 centuries, by the classical period, possibly much longer. The crown weaver's technique was a closely guarded family secret, passed from father to son. The exact pattern of weaving, the way the branches were bent and interlaced, the number of leaves that should appear on each side of the crown, all of these details were traditional and specific. The crown weaver would begin his work several days before the games. He would take the sealed bundles of branches, breaking the seals only in the presence of witnesses who would verify that the seals were intact and genuine. He would then sort through the branches, selecting the best ones for crown weaving. This selection process required expertise and judgment. Branches that were too stiff couldn't be woven properly. Branches that were too flexible wouldn't hold their shape. Branches with damaged or discolored leaves couldn't be used because the crowns needed to be beautiful. Once the appropriate branches were selected, the weaving would begin. Each crown took approximately 2 hours to weave, and the crown weaver would typically prepare 20 to 30 crowns before the games began. Not all of these would be used, but extras were necessary in case of damage or if additional crowns were needed. The unused crowns would be ritually destroyed after the games, burned as offerings to Zeus. They could never be kept or reused, because that would profane their sacred purpose. As each crown was completed, it would be inspected by a committee of officials. These inspectors would verify that the crown was woven correctly, that it contained only branches from the sacred grove. They could supposedly tell by the appearance and scent of the leaves, and that it met the aesthetic standards required for Olympic prizes. Once approved, each crown would be placed in a special box lined with cloth, where it would remain until the victory ceremony. The victory ceremony itself followed a strict protocol that had been established over centuries. When an athletic competition concluded and a victor was declared, there would be an immediate proclamation by the herald. The herald would announce the victor's name, his father's name, and his home city. This announcement was formulaic and had to be performed exactly correctly. If the herald made an error, he would have to start over. The announcement was legally significant because it established the official record of the victory. After the proclamation, the victor would be led to a specific location where officials waited with the crowns. But the crown wasn't simply handed over. First, there was a verification process. Officials would check their records to confirm that the person claiming victory was indeed the person who had been registered for the competition. Remember that ancient Greek athletic competitions didn't have photographs or detailed physical descriptions. Identity verification relied on personal recognition by officials and witnesses. Once identity was verified, a priest would take one of the prepared crowns from its box. He would hold it up for the assembled crowd to see, displaying it from all angles. This display served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the beauty and legitimacy of the prize. It allowed any observer who had concerns about the crown's authenticity to raise objections. This apparently never happened, but the protocol allowed for it. It created a dramatic moment that honored both the victor and the prize. Then, with appropriate ceremony, the priest would place the crown on the victor's head. The crowd would cheer. The herald would repeat the proclamation of victory. Other officials would make note in their records that the crown had been awarded. The entire process, from the end of the competition to the crowning, might take 30 minutes or longer, most of which was consumed by verification procedures and ceremonial protocol. But the bureaucratic work wasn't finished. After the crown was awarded, additional records needed to be created and maintained. The victor's name would be inscribed on official lists kept at Olympia. These lists went back centuries and were considered important historical documents. The inscription had to be done carefully and correctly because errors in the Olympic victor lists would corrupt the historical record. The victor's home city would also be notified officially. Olympia would send messengers to the city with official letters confirming the victory. These letters followed a standard format, included specific details about the competition, and bore official seals. The city would use these letters as the basis for their own celebrations and records. Some cities would inscribe the names of their Olympic victors on public monuments, and they relied on the official notifications from Olympia to ensure accuracy. There were also financial records to maintain, although supposedly the Olympic prizes were purely honorific. In reality, while the Olympic officials at Olympia didn't give cash prizes, victors often received substantial rewards from other sources. Their home cities would give them money, free meals for life, and other benefits. Private individuals would give them gifts. Athletes would receive appearance fees for attending festivals in other cities. All of this created a complex economy around Olympic victory, even though the official prize was just an olive crown. Olympia kept records of some of this secondary economy, not because they were directly involved in administering it, but because disputes would sometimes arise that required arbitration. If an athlete claimed his home city had promised him a reward that the city was now refusing to pay, he might appeal to the Olympic authorities to confirm his victory. The Olympic records would then become legal evidence in the dispute. This meant the records had to be meticulous and reliable. The record-keeping system at Olympia was quite sophisticated. Multiple copies of important documents were maintained. Stone inscriptions provided permanent public records that couldn't easily be altered. Papyrus documents provided detailed information that couldn't fit on stone inscriptions. Clay tablets provided temporary working records. The system had redundancy built in. If one type of record was damaged or lost, others could serve as backups. Different officials were responsible for different types of records. The grammateus, or secretary, maintained the official papyrus archives. The menemones, or remembrances, memorized important information and could recite it on demand as a check against written records. The hieromnemones, or sacred remembrances, specifically memorized the list of Olympic victors going back generations. Stone carvers maintained the inscribed records. This division of labor meant that no single person controlled the records, providing security against fraud or alteration. The entire system was designed to ensure that Olympic victories were recorded accurately and that the prizes awarded were genuine. The elaborate procedures around the sacred olive grove, the crown weaving, the victory ceremonies, and the record-keeping all served this purpose. What might seem like pointless bureaucracy was actually a carefully designed system of checks and verification intended to protect the integrity of the games. But who paid for all of this? The sacred grove needed constant maintenance. The officials needed to be compensated. The guards needed salaries. The crown weaver needed payment. The record keepers needed supplies: papyrus, ink, stone, tools. Where did the money come from to support this elaborate bureaucratic apparatus? The financial system supporting the Olympic bureaucracy was complex and evolved considerably over the centuries. In the earliest periods of the Olympic Games, probably in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the costs were relatively modest and were borne primarily by the city of Elis, which controlled Olympia. Elis was responsible for maintaining the sanctuary of Zeus, and the athletic games were part of that sanctuary's religious festival. The costs of the games were therefore considered part of Elis's religious obligations. But as the games grew in prestige and complexity, the costs increased dramatically. By the 5th century BCE, the Olympics had become a massive undertaking, requiring substantial financial resources. The sanctuary needed constant maintenance and expansion. New buildings were constructed: treasuries, temples, stoas, gymnasiums, baths. The athletic facilities needed upkeep. The sacred grove needed tending. The bureaucratic staff needed payment. The costs ran into thousands of drachmas annually, a substantial sum for any Greek city-state. Elis developed multiple revenue streams to support these costs. The most obvious source was religious offerings. Visitors to the sanctuary of Zeus would make offerings of money, valuable objects, and animals for sacrifice. A portion of these offerings went to support the sanctuary's operations, including the games. Wealthy individuals and cities would sometimes make large donations specifically to support the Olympics. These donations might be memorialized with inscriptions, giving the donors public recognition for their generosity. But religious offerings were unpredictable. A good year might bring substantial donations. A bad year might bring little. Elis needed more reliable revenue sources. One solution was to levy a tax on spectators attending the games. This tax wasn't called a ticket price. That would have been unseemly for a religious festival, but it functioned similarly. Officials at the entrances to the Olympic grounds would collect contributions from visitors. The amount was theoretically voluntary, but there were strong social pressures to contribute appropriately. Wealthy visitors were expected to contribute more than poor visitors. Elis also controlled the commercial activities around the games. During the Olympic festival, thousands of visitors would descend on Olympia: athletes, trainers, spectators, merchants, entertainers, philosophers, politicians. All these people needed food, water, accommodation, and various goods and services. Elis licensed merchants to operate at Olympia during the Games, charging fees for these licenses. The fees could be substantial, but merchants were willing to pay because the Olympics provided access to a large captive audience of customers. There were also fines. The Olympic rules were extensive and detailed, covering everything from training requirements to competition procedures to spectator behavior. Violations of these rules could result in fines, sometimes quite large. The fines were paid to the Olympic treasury and helped support the game's operations. Some of the bronze statues of Zeus that lined the entrance to the stadium were paid for with fines collected from cheating athletes. These statues served as both religious offerings and public reminders of the consequences of breaking the rules. Another revenue source was the sale of privilege. Certain positions at the Games, particularly positions as judges or officials, were prestigious and sought after. While these positions nominally went to qualified citizens of Elis, there were ways for wealthy individuals to support their own candidacy or their family members' candidacies. Donations to the sanctuary might be understood as supporting one's application for an official position. This wasn't exactly bribery, that would have been scandalous, but it was a kind of socially acceptable exchange of financial support for consideration. The city of Elis also derived indirect economic benefits from controlling the Olympics that helped offset the direct costs. The prestige of hosting the Games brought political influence. Other Greek cities would curry favor with Elis, offering trade advantages or political support in exchange for good relations with the city that controlled access to Zeus's favor. Elis could leverage this political capital in various ways that brought economic benefits. With these revenue streams, Elis could afford to maintain the elaborate bureaucratic system supporting the Games. Let's consider the costs in more detail. The sacred olive grove required a staff of at least a dozen people working year-round. The head gardener was a citizen who received an annual salary probably in the range of 300 to 500 drachmas, a comfortable middle-class income. Under him were assistant gardeners, water carriers, and general laborers, mostly slaves, but some free workers whose combined costs might amount to another 500 drachmas annually when you included food, clothing, and minimal wages for free workers. The crown weaver received payment for his work during each Olympic festival. His fee was probably around 100 drachmas per Olympics, paid for producing the crowns and maintaining the weaving traditions. This might not sound like much, but remember that the Olympics occurred only once every 4 years, so this was a periodic rather than regular income. The crown weaver likely had other work between Olympics, perhaps weaving ceremonial crowns for other religious festivals. The record-keeping staff was more extensive. The chief secretary received an annual salary probably comparable to the head gardeners, 300 to 500 drachmas. He supervised a staff of subordinate secretaries and scribes who maintained the various records. Some of these were citizens receiving salaries. Others were educated slaves owned by the sanctuary. The total annual cost for the record-keeping operation might have been 800 to 1,000 drachmas. Then there were guards. The Olympic facilities needed security year-round, but especially during the Games when valuable offerings accumulated at the sanctuary and when the sealed olive branches needed protection. A security force of perhaps 20 to 30 guards would be required during the Games, scaling down to perhaps 5 to 10 during the rest of the year. Guards were typically free men, not slaves, receiving daily wages. The annual cost for security might have been 500 to 700 drachmas. The judges and officials who actually ran the competitions were citizens of Elis who served for individual Olympic festivals rather than year-round. The Hellenodikai, the board of judges who oversaw the Games, typically consisted of 9 to 12 men who served for each 4-year Olympic period. They received extensive training and during the Games themselves received daily stipends for their work. The total cost for the judges over a 4-year Olympic cycle might have been 3,000 to 4,000 drachmas. Add to this the costs of maintaining the buildings, supplying materials for record-keeping, papyrus wasn't cheap, feeding and housing officials during the Games, and various miscellaneous expenses, and the total annual cost of running the Olympic bureaucracy probably exceeded 5,000 drachmas, with costs spiking much higher during the actual Olympic festival years. 5,000 drachmas might not sound like an enormous sum, but remember that this was in a world where a skilled craftsman might earn 300 to 400 drachmas per year. The annual cost of the Olympic bureaucracy was equivalent to the yearly wages of 12 to 15 skilled workers. For a city-state like Elis, which was not one of the wealthiest or most populous Greek cities, this represented a significant financial commitment. The financial records documenting all this spending were themselves part of the bureaucratic system. Temple treasurers maintained detailed accounts of income and expenditure. These accounts were inscribed on stone stelae and displayed publicly allowing citizens to verify that the sanctuary's finances were being managed properly. Some of these financial inscriptions have survived, giving us remarkable insight into the economics of the ancient Olympics. One surviving inscription from the 4th century BCE lists expenditures for a single Olympic festival. It includes line items for sacrificial animals, 43 oxen at an average cost of 50 drachmas each, wine for libations, 20 amphorae at 3 drachmas per amphora, olive oil for anointing statues, 15 liters at 2 drachmas per liter, papyrus for records, 40 rolls at 1 drachma per roll, payment to heralds, 3 heralds at 10 drachmas each for their service during the games, and dozens of other specific expenses. The level of detail is extraordinary, documenting spending that seems almost trivial. 3 obols for rope to secure a tent, half a drachma for replacement sandals for a guard. Why such meticulous financial record keeping? Partly this was about accountability. The sanctuary's finances were, in theory, public property held in trust for Zeus. Mismanagement or theft of sacred funds was both a crime and a sacrilege. Public display of detailed financial records helped ensure that officials were honest and that any irregularities could be detected. But the detailed records also served another purpose. They established precedent and procedure. If officials in one Olympic cycle spent a certain amount on a particular item or service, officials in the next cycle would know what the appropriate cost should be. The records functioned as an institutional memory, allowing the bureaucracy to maintain consistency across generations even as individual officials changed. The payment to the crown weaver provides an interesting case study in how these financial procedures worked. The crown weaver's fee was not arbitrary. It was based on traditional precedent, on the amount that crown weavers had been paid in previous Olympics. This amount was recorded in the financial accounts, and any significant change would require justification and approval by the Hellenodikai. If the crown weaver requested higher payment, he would need to explain why. Perhaps materials had become more expensive, or the number of crowns required had increased. His request would be reviewed by a committee that would consult the historical records. They would look at what previous crown weavers had been paid. They would verify his claims about increased costs or increased work. They might consult with other officials about appropriate compensation. Only after this review process would the payment be approved or denied. The decision would then be recorded, creating a new precedent that would guide future payment decisions. This might seem like excessive bureaucracy for determining how much to pay someone to weave some olive crowns. But from the Greek perspective, every aspect of the Olympics needed to be done correctly, according to tradition, with proper procedure. Arbitrary or irregular payments would suggest chaos and mismanagement, which would dishonor Zeus and compromise the sacred nature of the games. The bureaucracy, tedious as it was, ensured order and propriety. The crown weaver also provides an example of how Olympic-related positions could become valuable hereditary privileges. The family that held the crown weaving position received not only direct payment, but also prestige and social status. They were part of the Olympic establishment, connected to one of the most important religious and cultural institutions in the Greek world. This status could be leveraged in various ways, in business relationships, in political negotiations, in marriage alliances. The hereditary nature of many Olympic positions created a kind of bureaucratic aristocracy in Elis. Certain families controlled certain positions generation after generation. The family of the head gardener, the family of the crown weaver, families that traditionally provided members of the Hellenodikai. These families formed an interconnected network that controlled access to Olympic administration. This network was generally stable and effective at maintaining the game's traditions, but it also meant that Olympic administration was somewhat insular and resistant to change. There were occasional challenges to this system. Sometimes a family line would die out, requiring a new family to take over a hereditary position. This could create controversy, with multiple families claiming the right to the position based on various traditional or familial connections. These disputes would need to be resolved by the Alien Assembly or by other officials, often requiring extensive investigation into family histories and traditional precedents. One recorded case from the 3rd century BCE involved a dispute over the crown weaver position. The family that had held the position for generations had only daughters in one generation, no sons. When the crown weaver died, the question arose whether the position could pass through a daughter to her husband or whether it should go to a male cousin of the deceased crown weaver. The dispute went on for months, with both parties presenting arguments based on traditional practice, religious propriety, and family law. Eventually, the Hellenodikai ruled that the position should go to the male cousin, maintaining the principle that Olympic positions should pass through male lines. But they also granted a substantial cash payment to the daughter and her husband, compensating them for the loss of the position. This compromise satisfied neither party completely, but it resolved the immediate problem and established a precedent for future similar disputes. The resolution of this dispute required consulting extensive records of previous succession cases, testimony from elderly citizens who remembered earlier precedents, and interpretation of traditional practices. Officials spent weeks reviewing documents and interviewing witnesses. The entire process consumed time and resources that might seem disproportionate to the importance of determining who would weave olive crowns. But again, from the Greek perspective, every detail of Olympic administration mattered. Getting it right was essential. The financial accounts also reveal the costs of maintaining the actual olive trees in the sacred grove. These costs were not trivial. Olive trees require regular pruning, which had to be done by skilled arborists using proper techniques. The sacred grove's trees required special care because they couldn't be pruned as aggressively as commercial olive trees. Maintaining an attractive appearance was as important as maintaining health. The pruning costs alone might amount to 100 to 200 drachmas per year. Water was another significant expense. Olympia's climate is Mediterranean, with hot, dry summers. Olive trees are drought-resistant, but still need water, especially during the hottest months. The sacred grove had a sophisticated irrigation system drawing water from the nearby Clodeos River. Maintaining this irrigation system, clearing channels, repairing water wheels, paying water carriers, cost money. The annual water-related expenses for the grove might have been another 100 to 200 drachmas. Fertilization was also considered necessary, though ancient Greek understanding of soil fertility was limited. Officials would arrange for manure to be brought to the grove and worked into the soil around the trees. This was another expense, requiring payment to suppliers and laborers. The records show regular expenditures for enriching the sacred earth. As the inscriptions euphemistically put it, pest control was another concern. Olive trees can be affected by various insects and diseases. Ancient Greeks had limited tools for dealing with these problems, but they did what they could. Some inscriptions mention payments for cleansing the sacred trees, which probably involved removing diseased branches or treating trees with various substances thought to repel pests. Whether these treatments were effective is questionable, but they cost money regardless. All of these agricultural expenses added up. The total annual cost of maintaining the sacred olive grove, labor, water, fertilization, pest control, tools, and miscellaneous supplies probably approached 1,000 drachmas in most years. For a grove that produced nothing except branches for crowns once every 4 years, this was a substantial investment. But it was an investment in religious and cultural prestige, not in economic productivity. The value of the grove was symbolic rather than material. The grove also required protection from accidental or deliberate damage. The sacred nature of the trees meant that damaging them was sacrilege. The area was fenced, and guards patrolled regularly. Despite these precautions, there were occasional incidents. One inscription records a case where a visitor, apparently drunk, climbed a tree in the sacred grove and broke several branches. He was caught, fined a substantial sum. The inscription says 500 drachmas, a huge fine, and apparently banned from ever returning to Olympia. Another case involved accusations of deliberate sabotage. Someone claimed that agents from a rival city had poisoned several trees in the sacred grove, attempting to strike at Ellis's prestige by attacking the source of the Olympic crowns. An investigation was conducted involving examination of the trees by agricultural experts and interviews with guards and other witnesses. The investigation found no evidence of deliberate poisoning. The tree's poor health was attributed to natural causes, but the fact that such an investigation was necessary shows how seriously the security of the grove was taken. The meticulous record-keeping extended even to individual branches cut from the grove. When branches were harvested for crown weaving, a record would be made noting which specific tree each bundle of branches came from. This level of detail seems almost obsessive, but it served a purpose. If there was ever any question about the authenticity of a crown, officials could theoretically trace it back to the specific tree that provided the branches. This chain of custody documentation provided security against fraud and ensured that every detail of the prize-giving process could be verified if necessary. But did anyone ever actually check all these records and verify all these details? Or was this elaborate bureaucratic system mostly for show, creating an appearance of security and authenticity that was rarely tested in practice? The question of whether all this bureaucratic detail was ever actually used brings us to the handful of documented cases where the Olympic prize system was challenged, investigated, or somehow went wrong. These cases reveal that the elaborate procedures were not merely ceremonial. They were actively employed when disputes arose or when irregularities were suspected. The system was tested, and the records show us how it functioned under pressure. The most famous case involved an athlete named Eupolemus of Thessaly, who competed in the chariot races at the Olympics in 396 BCE. Eupolemus won his race and was awarded his olive crown in the normal ceremonial manner. But within days of his victory, accusations began to circulate. Rival athletes and their supporters claimed that Eupolemus had bribed other competitors to deliberately crash their chariots or hold back during the race, allowing him to win more easily. Bribery was strictly forbidden at the Olympics, and if proven, would result in disqualification, heavy fines, and permanent disgrace. The Hellenodikai were obligated to investigate these accusations. They began by interviewing witnesses, other athletes, trainers, spectators who might have observed suspicious behavior. They examined the race results in detail, looking for any anomalies in how the competition had unfolded. They reviewed the registration records for all the competitors, checking for any connections between Eupolemus and the accused co-conspirators that might suggest coordination. The investigation took weeks. During this time, Eupolemus's olive crown was technically still his, but his victory was under a cloud of suspicion. The investigation eventually concluded that the bribery accusations were credible. Several competitors admitted under questioning that they had received payments from Eupolemus's representatives to perform poorly. The evidence was considered sufficient for the Hellenodikai to take action. But what action could they take? Eupolemus had already been crowned. The crown had been placed on his head in a public ceremony. The heralds had proclaimed his victory. His name had been inscribed in the official victor lists. How do you undo an Olympic victory after it has been officially confirmed? The solution required elaborate bureaucratic procedures. First, the Hellenodikai formally declared the victory invalid. This declaration had to be made publicly, with the same ceremony and formality as the original victory proclamation. Heralds announced that Eupolemus's victory was void, that he had dishonored Zeus and profaned the sacred games. The crowd that gathered for this announcement was smaller than the crowd that had witnessed the victory, but the declaration was made with full official authority. Next, Eupolemus's crown had to be retrieved. He had already left Olympia and returned to Thessaly, taking his crown with him. Officials sent messengers to Thessaly, demanding the crown's return. Eupolemus initially refused, claiming that the investigation was biased and that his victory was legitimate. This refusal created a diplomatic incident between Elis and Thessaly. Eventually, under pressure from Thessalian authorities, who didn't want to be embroiled in a religious controversy with Olympia, Eupolemus returned the crown. The returned crown was ritually destroyed. It couldn't simply be discarded or reused. It had been profaned by its association with fraud. A ceremony was held where the crown was burned as an offering to Zeus, with prayers asking the gods forgiveness for the corruption that had sullied the games. The ashes were collected and buried in a specific location within the sanctuary. Then came the extensive record correction. Eupolemus's name had to be removed from the victor lists. This required physically altering stone inscriptions, which was difficult and expensive. Stone carvers had to chisel away the carved letters of Eupolemus's name. On some inscriptions, they simply defaced his name, making it illegible. On others, they carved new text, explaining that the recorded victory had been invalidated. The process of correcting all the relevant inscriptions took months. The papyrus records also needed correction. Officials went through the archives, finding every document that mentioned Eupolemus's victory and adding annotations noting the disqualification. Some documents were completely rewritten. The amended documents had to be certified by multiple officials, with their seals attesting that the corrections had been made properly and that the new records were accurate. The case also established that there was no actual winner of that year's chariot race. The competition had been so corrupted by bribery that the Hellenodikai ruled no one deserved the victory. This decision was itself controversial. Some argued that the runner-up who hadn't been involved in bribery should be declared the winner. But the judges ruled that since the bribery had affected multiple competitors' performances, there was no way to know who would have won in a fair competition. The race was declared void, and no crown was awarded for that event in that Olympics. This created a gap in the historical record. The victor lists for the Olympics in 396 BCE show most events having winners, but the chariot race entry says, "No crown awarded due to impiety." This note required its own explanation, so a longer inscription was created describing the Eupolemus case in detail. That inscription has partially survived, which is how we know the details of this case. The financial costs of this scandal were substantial. The investigation required paying for messengers, housing and feeding witnesses during their testimony, compensating officials for their time, and covering the costs of document correction. The total expense probably exceeded 1,000 drachmas. There were also the fines imposed on Eupolemus and the co-conspirators, which went into the Olympic treasury. These fines were used to commission bronze statues of Zeus, which were erected along the entrance to the stadium, with inscriptions explaining that they were paid for with fines from cheaters. 6 such statues were commissioned from the Eupolemus scandal, costing several thousand drachmas in total, but also paid for by the fines collected. This case demonstrated that the elaborate Olympic bureaucracy was not merely decorative. When challenged, the system could investigate, make determinations, and enforce consequences. The detailed records made the investigation possible. The multiple levels of documentation meant that fraud could be detected and proven. The established procedures for crown distribution meant that there were clear protocols for what to do when something went wrong. There were other, less dramatic cases that also tested the system. One case involved a crown that was damaged during the victory ceremony. As the priest was placing it on the victor's head, a strong gust of wind blew it away, and it tumbled across the ground, becoming broken and dirty. This created a dilemma. The crown had been properly awarded and placed on the victor's head, completing the ritual. But it was now broken. Did the victor deserve a replacement crown, or was the damaged crown sufficient since the ritual had been completed? The Hellenodikai debated this question, consulting precedents. They found 2 previous cases, one from 80 years earlier and one from over a century before, where crowns had been damaged under various circumstances. In one case, a replacement had been given. In the other case, no replacement was provided, and the victor kept the damaged crown. The circumstances of those cases were analyzed in detail to determine which precedent applied to the current situation. Eventually, the judges ruled that a replacement crown should be provided because the damage had occurred during the official ceremony, before the victor had properly taken possession of the crown. If the damage had occurred after the ceremony was complete, no replacement would be given. That would be the victor's responsibility. But since the damage happened during the ritual itself, the ritual was considered incomplete, and a proper crown needed to be provided. A new crown was woven from the reserved branches kept for emergencies. A second ceremony was held, simpler than the first, but still following proper protocol. The damaged crown was ritually destroyed. Detailed records were made of the entire incident, explaining why 2 crowns had been used for one victory and accounting for the branches used. The unusual case was inscribed on a stone tablet as a permanent record and precedent for future officials to consult. Even the routine, uneventful prize distributions required extensive documentation. After each Olympic festival, a comprehensive report would be prepared listing every competition, every victor, every crown awarded. This report would include not just names, but also details about the crown weaving process. Any irregularities, even minor ones, like a slightly delayed ceremony, and financial information about the costs. These reports were presented to the Elean Assembly for approval and then archived as official records. The archives at Olympia became quite extensive over the centuries. By the Roman period, there were centuries of accumulated records, stone inscriptions, papyrus documents, clay tablets, and the memorized knowledge of the sacred remembrances. This archive was a valuable historical resource, consulted by historians and chroniclers who wanted to verify facts about past Olympics. The existence of these records made it possible for later writers, like Pausanias, to provide detailed information about Olympic history going back centuries. But maintaining such extensive archives had costs. Storage space was needed. Dry, secure buildings where papyrus wouldn't deteriorate and stone inscriptions could be organized and accessed. Archivists were needed to catalog materials, maintain the storage facilities, and help officials find relevant documents when needed. The cost of archive maintenance was probably at least several hundred drachmas annually, another expense in the already expensive Olympic bureaucracy. The archives also faced occasional disasters. We know from ancient sources that there were at least 2 significant fires at Olympia that destroyed portions of the records. After each fire, officials had to reconstruct what they could from memory, from copies held elsewhere, and from stone inscriptions that survived the fires. The reconstruction process was painstaking, involving interviews with elderly citizens who remembered information that might not be in surviving documents, and consultation with other sanctuaries that might have relevant records. One fire in the late 3rd century BCE destroyed a significant portion of the papyrus archives. The stone inscriptions survived, but many detailed administrative records were lost. Officials spent years attempting to reconstruct the lost information. They created new documents based on surviving evidence and memory, but these reconstructed documents were carefully marked as reconstructions rather than original records. The distinction mattered because original records were considered more authoritative than reconstructions. The Roman conquest of Greece in the 2nd century BCE brought changes to the Olympic bureaucratic system, though not immediately. Initially, the Romans allowed the games to continue operating much as they had before, under Aelian administration with traditional procedures. But gradually, Roman influence increased. Roman officials began to take interest in Olympic administration. Roman ideas about record-keeping and accounting began to influence the system. Roman bureaucratic practices were in some ways more sophisticated than Greek ones. The Romans had developed advanced accounting methods, standardized forms and procedures, and professional administrative classes. Some of these Roman innovations were adopted at Olympia. The record-keeping became more systematized, with standardized document formats that made information easier to find and compare across years. Financial accounting became more detailed and followed Roman models. But the Roman period also saw the beginning of the system's slow decline. As Greek culture became absorbed into the Roman Empire, the Olympics gradually lost some of their central importance in Mediterranean culture. The games continued. They would continue for another 5 centuries after Roman conquest, but they became less central to Greek identity and more like a traditional festival, maintained partly out of conservatism and partly as a tourist attraction. The sacred olive grove continued to be maintained according to traditional practices, but the religious significance slowly diminished. Some Roman visitors found the Greek obsession with olive crowns rather quaint. Why go to such effort for a crown of leaves when Roman generals received golden wreaths and emperors wore crowns of precious metals? The Roman Emperor Nero, who competed in the Olympics in 67 CE and won every event he entered through blatant corruption and intimidation, apparently found the olive crown insufficiently impressive and had additional golden crowns made for himself. The bureaucratic system persisted, but it increasingly seemed like an elaborate mechanism serving a declining purpose. Officials continued to maintain detailed records, inspect the olive grove, weave crowns according to ancient techniques, and follow centuries-old protocols. But the cultural context that had made all this bureaucracy meaningful was slowly eroding. The games were becoming a vestige of a past age, maintained through institutional momentum rather than vital cultural necessity. The final end came in 393 CE, when the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius I banned pagan festivals, including the Olympics. The last recorded Olympic festival was in 393 CE, or possibly 393 to 397 CE. The records from this final period are fragmentary. After the ban, the sanctuary of Zeus was closed. The sacred olive grove was no longer maintained for religious purposes. Some trees were probably cut down, others were allowed to grow wild or were incorporated into ordinary agricultural use. The bureaucratic records were scattered or destroyed. Some papyrus documents survived for centuries afterward in various archives and were eventually recovered by archaeologists. Some stone inscriptions remained in place and can still be read today. But the living system, the officials who knew the procedures, the families who had held hereditary positions for generations, the institutional memory maintained through practice and tradition, that system ended completely within a generation or two of the game's closure. By the mid-5th century CE, perhaps 50 years after the last Olympics, probably no one alive remembered the detailed procedures for managing the sacred grove or weaving the victory crowns. The specialized knowledge accumulated over a millennium was simply lost. When the Olympics were revived in modern times in 1896, the organizers had to reconstruct Greek practices from fragmentary ancient sources. They got some things right and many things wrong because the detailed procedural knowledge, the knowledge that had been maintained through the bureaucratic system, was gone. What can we learn from this elaborate system of olive grove management and prize distribution? On one level, it's a story about the extraordinary effort humans will invest in maintaining traditions and symbols they consider important. The ancient Greeks devoted enormous resources, money, labor, detailed attention, to ensuring that Olympic victors received crowns woven from the proper olive branches. From a purely practical standpoint, this was absurd. The crowns had no material value. Any olive branch would serve the ceremonial purpose equally well. The elaborate verification and documentation systems served no practical function. But from the Greek perspective, every detail mattered because the Olympics were sacred. The crowns weren't just symbols. They were sacred objects conveying Zeus's favor. Ensuring their authenticity through elaborate procedures wasn't bureaucratic excess. It was religious necessity. The tedious record-keeping, the hereditary positions, the detailed financial accounting, the investigations and precedent-setting, all of this served to maintain the game's sacred character. The system also reveals how bureaucracies develop and perpetuate themselves. Each procedural safeguard creates the need for more procedures to manage and document the safeguard. Record-keeping requires archivists, which requires records of the archivist's work, which requires more archivists. Hereditary positions create succession disputes, which require dispute resolution procedures, which create precedents, which require documentation and interpretation. The system grows more complex over time, not through anyone's deliberate design, but through the accretion of responses to problems and challenges. Yet the system was also remarkably stable and effective for over 1,000 years. Despite occasional scandals and disputes, the Olympic prize distribution system maintained its integrity and credibility for longer than most modern institutions have existed. The elaborate bureaucracy, tedious as it was, successfully accomplished its primary goal, ensuring that Olympic victors received authentic prizes according to ancient traditions. That's an impressive achievement, regardless of whether we think the goal was worth the effort. The story also illustrates how institutional knowledge can be lost. The detailed procedures that took centuries to develop and refine were lost within a few decades when the social context changed. No amount of written documentation could preserve the practical knowledge embedded in active practice. The Olympic bureaucrats of the 4th century CE probably assumed their system was permanent and their procedures would continue forever. They couldn't imagine a world where no one knew how to properly harvest branches from the sacred grove or weave a victory crown according to traditional techniques. Yet that world arrived within their grandchildren's lifetimes. Finally, there's something poignant about the sheer mundane effort behind cultural glory. When we think of ancient Olympic victors, we imagine triumph and glory, the champion crowned with olive, celebrated by cheering crowds, returning home to honor and rewards. We don't usually imagine the accountants tracking olive oil expenses, or the archivists filing papyrus documents, or the committee meetings to resolve succession disputes over hereditary positions. But the glory was only possible because of the mundane work. Somewhere in ancient Olympia, around 200 BCE, there was a middle-aged man whose entire career was maintaining the financial records for the sacred olive grove. He spent his days making entries in account books, noting expenditures for pruning and fertilizer, tracking the allocation of water, recording the harvest of branches for crown weaving. His work was never celebrated. His name appears in no historical accounts. He won no glory and left no monuments. But without his tedious, careful record-keeping and the work of hundreds of officials like him across the centuries, the glory of Olympic victory would not have been possible. The Olympic victors stood in the sun wearing their olive crowns, celebrated by the Greek world. Behind them, invisible in the bureaucratic archives, were ledgers and inventories and personnel records and procedure manuals, the unglamorous infrastructure that made the glory possible. The boring history of the olive grove accountants is as much a part of the Olympic story as the athletes themselves, even if it's a part we rarely think about or celebrate. And perhaps that's true of most human achievements. Behind every moment of glory or beauty or triumph, there's usually an infrastructure of mundane work, record-keeping, maintenance, administration, the thousand small tasks that make extraordinary things possible. The ancient Olympic bureaucracy, with all its tedious procedures and elaborate safeguards, is a reminder that greatness often depends on the willingness of people to perform boring but necessary work with care and dedication, even when that work will never be celebrated or remembered.